Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. My colleague Rowena Ichon is away this week. In lieu of our traditional discussion about California politics and policy this week, we have a very interesting conversation about a topic that's on the minds of the nearly 12 million Catholics that call California home, and that's the legacy of Pope Francis and the papal conclave that begins this week. It's been said that Pope Francis was both a hugely consequential leader of the Catholic Church, extremely popular with his charismatic style eschewing the trappings of power, and also rather controversial with his left-leaning social activism and embrace of political stances, including an environmental encyclical. And so to discuss Pope Francis's legacy and give a preview of the papal conclave, we have a terrific guest this week. We're so pleased to speak with Ambassador Francis Rooney. Ambassador Rooney was the U.S. Ambassador to the Vatican, or really the Holy See, during the George W. Bush administration. And yes, we get into the differences between the Vatican and the Holy See during our interview. He's also a former member of Congress, and he's served as the CEO of his family's construction business, which has built many iconic buildings across the country, including football stadiums and state capitol buildings and even presidential libraries. We talk about how American Catholics will remember Pope Francis, what to expect from the conclave, and he also offers his advice on the path the next pope should take on global affairs, including dealings with the Trump administration. Now, before we start our interview, one brief announcement. We hope you'll join PRI on Friday, May 16th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time for our special live webinar with Jason Riley, Manhattan Institute Fellow and Wall Street Journal columnist. He'll be speaking with our Lance Azumi, Senior Director of PRI Center for Education, about his new book, The Affirmative Action Myth. Now, to watch the webinar live and submit questions for the panelists, go to pacificresearch.org/events to register today. The webinar is free to register for, but you must register in order to watch it live and submit your questions. And so after the break, we hope you'll stay tuned for our great conversation with Ambassador Francis Rooney. Thanks for joining us. We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates, so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. Ambassador Rooney, thank you for joining us on Next Round Podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
So it's a great honor to have you here to talk about the legacy of Pope Francis and the road ahead with the election of a new pope soon upon us. Now, you have a very unique point of view given your tenure as ambassador under President George W. Bush, which you've written about in your terrific book, which I highly recommend and enjoyed reading, The Global Vatican. Before we get into the discussion of Pope Francis, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you, let's talk a little bit about your tenure. So how did you find yourself in the role of ambassador to begin with? And, what was your experience like? And I think more importantly, we all want to know, what's it like meeting with a pope representing the United States?
Well, I got the position because of my strong relationship, long-term relationship with George W. Bush. And this was an important, as a deeply religious president, this was a very important position for him to fill. And I'm honored that he would consider me for it. One of the most interesting moments was the very first one. The way it works is you go to present your credentials to the Pope, and my family and aunts and cousins and stuff, a whole bunch of people came with me, and we did photo ops in the office, the same one where they just had Trump here a while back, and the official receiving room. And then everybody left but me and the Pope, and we sat down across a desk, and they shut the door. And I was so nervous I could hardly speak. So finally he started speaking and kind of put me at ease, and then we could get about our agenda of things that we that the administration wanted me to raise with him when I credentialed up. And so it went well. And it was every time I got to go see him about something, it was just always tremendous experience to be there with the Pope. And we had President Bush came, I think it was 2007, and we talked about 16 different countries where the United States and the Holy See had areas of mutual interest to work on diplomatically. And then Mrs. Bush came with her daughter, and the daughter had worked in I think it was an AIDS clinic in South Africa. So we got to talking about Africa, and that was where the first time I ever heard anybody mention about the radical Islamic madrasas that had been started up in Mali and Niger and the west coast of tropical Africa. And the Pope brought that up. And turns out, it wasn't 5 years later, we had breakouts all over the area of radical Islamic activity.
It was a good thing we did not have you microphoned up during your first meeting with the Pope, because we might have heard your heart beating.
Yeah. And I asked him, I said, I guess this happens a lot with you, doesn't it? He said, yeah, it does. He had a great sense of humor. People said Pope Benedict didn't have a sense of humor. He had a great sense of humor. There was one time in the very beginning when the president wanted Mrs. Bush to come head up the delegation to the Winter Olympics in Torino. And she said she would only do it if she could go meet the Pope. So I went in to see the Secretary of State, who at the time was Cardinal Sodano. And I said, look, Miss Bush wants to come see the Pope. And he said, well, that's hard because the Holy Father only sees heads of state or incoming ambassadors. I said, well, you need to make an exception for Mrs. Bush, okay? Because Mr. Bush really wants her to do this. And so the next two or 3 days later, we had that annual event where all the ambassadors line up and walk up and greet the Pope, and the Pope greets each ambassador and says a few words. It was like on the 2nd of January or something. So when I went up to him, Kathleen and I, we walk up and he says, so I guess we're going to have Mrs. Bush. I said, well, if you say so. He started laughing.
One of the things that I thought was interesting in your book and would be, I think, good before we get into the discussion going forward, you make the point early in your book that about the distinction in the terminology between the Vatican and the Holy See. And I thought that'd be good for our listeners to hear your explanation of the distinction between the two.
That's a very good idea because a lot of people don't realize that nuance. The Vatican is a small piece of property in Rome that was granted to the church when after Garibaldi, when they reunified Italy and took away all the Holy Sees, the rest of their properties. And the Holy See is the real center of authority. That's who our mission is with, because it's from Latin, the holy chair, and it means the seat of the influence, seat of the doctrine, seat of the ability of the Catholic Church to impact events around the world and save souls. And so that's what's really important. And so our mission's with the Holy See, as are all the other missions. By the way, the Holy See has the second largest diplomatic representation of any country after the United States.
I mean, I think all of us watching the funeral, that probably makes sense, seeing how many people came from around the world, as far as heads of states and dignitaries. So
yeah, I think I put it in my book, that early on, back in the 1800s or something, some of the Muslim countries decided they wanted to have embassies. I think it was Turkey, because they wanted to find, get in on what's going on over there and what the Holy See could tell them and things like that. So it goes way back in terms of being a very broad and diverse representation.
So let's talk about Pope Francis and his legacy. He was certainly a very consequential pope, I think most would argue. Some would say, he was controversial in some of the things that he did. Kind of looking at the direction that he took the church, what do you think his legacy, the legacy of his time as pope, will ultimately be? And do you think, a lot of the changes that he made and the direction that he wanted to take the church, do you think those will be long-lasting changes or more short-lived?
Well, okay. I think that his papacy will be remembered as an almost revolutionary one. I mean, he overhauled the concept of where cardinals are, and he appointed cardinals all around the world, even in places with very few Catholics. I mean, they appointed a guy in Mongolia where there's 1,500 Catholics. And I think they put one in Madagascar. So instead of being a Catholic-centric position, it's a geographic reach position. Then, as everybody knows, he was very focused on social causes, the plight of the marginalized people, climate. That was a new one for the Holy See. And then the last thing he did that you may not know is he did a lot of internal reform, aggregating a lot of power right up to his office in terms like dealing with the funds of the Vatican. He set up a new operation for that after that that scandal in London. He de-emphasized some of the roles of the Secretary of State and conducted a lot of diplomacy personally, like when he worked to get the relations with Cuba opened up for Obama, and when he appointed his own minister to deal with the crisis in the Ukraine instead of going through the Secretary of State's office. So he covered a lot of territory in a very novel and new way. And I'm sure a lot of it's going to stick. It's kind of hard for the church not to recognize how right he was about focusing on social causes and marginalized people. I mean, that goes back to Jesus. So I think those things will probably stick. I don't know if the Curia reforms will stick so much, because I think the Curia is going to want to kind of regain their historic bandwidth. And then the geographic expansion, what will be interesting there is how many of those cardinals, when they resign in some of these far out places with no Catholics, how many of them have a reappointed cardinal there, or whether it just goes away.
Like myself, I think a lot of American Catholics might have a little bit of the conflicted view when thinking about the legacy of Pope Francis. On the one hand, you can't help but find very appealing and enduring, his affinity for the common man and the rejection of all the trappings, right? And his charismatic style, his warmth and openness. I mean, that day when he was in Washington, received by Speaker Boehner, that's still a memorable moment people are talking about. And whenever he came to the United States, he got a rock star reception. And as we just had mentioned, some of these changes that he ushered in, rankled some American Catholics. So from the American view, how do you think Americans and American Catholics are going to remember Pope Francis?
Well, I think they're going to, this kind of yin and yang style, not to call it schism, but difference of view about what the church ought to be doing and where it ought to go. It's going to play out in the United States for sure. I mean, there are people that and that goes back to Vatican II, but it's played out ever since, and even before Vatican II, since Leo the 13th. And so, whether to begin anew and radically overhaul the core Christian doctrine like Francis wanted to, or evolve within more of a narrow lane of traditional doctrine. And that's going to get played out now, I think, as they have this conclave and decide who to pick.
So we mentioned the environmental encyclical and some of the social causes and work that he undertook as Pope. How does what he did here compare to the actions of other popes? Do you think he was more political than your typical pope, or is that pretty much a pretty standard thing? The kind of the influence he exerted in the direction that he took in their own way, that other popes weren't afraid to really take a stand in their time.
Well, certainly Pope John Paul II wasn't afraid to take a stand against communism, and that became the principal memory of Pope John Paul II. And he did a fantastic thing in working with the United States and United Kingdom and other countries to help bring down communism in Poland. So that was political in a different way. The social orientation politics of Pope Francis I think they were kind of almost unique. I don't remember any pope being that far out front on social issues since Leo the 13th wrote Rerum Novarum. And so that's probably going to be tuned back a little bit. It won't go away. I mean, obviously the church needs to focus on those things to some degree, but like you say, the climate one is kind of out of nowhere. And it's a good thing to focus on in a general sense, because a lot of marginalized people are going to be the ones who are most adversely affected that live down around the equator. So it's a legitimate church interest from that point of view. But I'm not sure that the way he addressed it was the way I would have addressed it. Okay, I would have addressed some of the deficiencies of some of these corrupt governments that despoiling their environment and taking bribes in the process all the time.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. We know that aside from his role as the head of the church, he's a really hugely inspirational figure globally, and one who, as you said, plays an important role in not only influencing global opinion, but even foreign policy. And you write a lot about this in your book, and the relationship specifically between the U.S. and the Catholic Church really since the founding of our country. You share a story, your experience in the sort of tension between Pope Benedict and President Bush over the war in Iraq. So in light of all of the challenges around the world, it kind of begs the question, what relationship has the Vatican had with our current president, President Trump, under Pope Francis's papacy, and how has it differed at all versus our relationship historically?
Well, I think it's been a little rockier than I recall previous popes, certainly than I recall John Paul II and Pope Benedict, who were very close to the United States, very supportive. I think Pope Francis has criticized the president personally on a few things, and he certainly criticized the United States on some things. And I think he got out there pretty far, really, particularly on the area of immigration, which is, has become a overwhelming and very challenging issue in the United States right now.
So I think one really unique, I would argue, kind of a, really neat thing right now for American Catholics is the fact that we have a Catholic today who's Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. And, it's interesting, one of the final acts by Pope Francis on the day before he died was to meet with the Vice President. So, of course, the meeting was preceded by, church officials not so subtly expressing their displeasure with some of the Trump policies. So how do you expect the next pope, whoever is elected, what kind of relationship do you anticipate that they would have with the Trump administration in the coming years? And I think more interestingly, how influential a role do you think J.D. Vance will play in shaping the U.S.-Vatican relationship going forward?
Well, anybody that prognosticates on any of those subjects is bound to be wrong. It's a very treacherous ground, but I think that the next pope, they're going to want to pick someone that's not quite out front so far on so many things and kind of get a little more back to the middle, not necessarily go back to the conservatism of Pope Benedict, but somewhere where you can have an adherence and focus on church doctrine and teaching as well as be sensitive to social needs. And I think that would probably be a kind of a good solution, more of a traditional Pope role. As far as Vance, you can't beat his timing, huh? Pretty incredible. But I don't really think he'll be particularly effective because he's a Catholic. The one that was most effective, interestingly enough, Catholic president was President Kennedy, and he didn't even know why. The reason he was so effective is once a Catholic became president, the anti-Catholic prejudice dropped off precipitously, and you can see it in graphs and surveys after he did that appearance at a big Baptist convention in Houston while he was running. So he had a really long-lasting impact on the role of Catholics in the United States.
So, of course, as we tape this podcast, we're just on the cusp of the start of the papal conclave. And, speaking of timing, all the moviegoers who watch the award-winning film Conclave, well, we feel like we have a bit of a better idea of what goes on behind closed doors. But your book really does give us a lot of behind-the-scenes anecdotes on the inner workings of the church. So hoping you can give us a little insight on the conclave. So from your vantage point as a former ambassador, and certainly as a longtime observer, what should we expect from the conclave process? Do you think it's more likely, we'll have a consensus candidate emerge pretty quickly? Or do you think we're in for many days of black smoke coming out of the chimney?
Once again, that's a treacherous piece of dirt to be prognosticating about. I don't think it'll be particularly long, but it won't be right away either. There's going to have to be time for these two conflicting views of the church to be discussed back and forth and assuaged, and someone will ultimately emerge who can gain enough of each side, so to speak. And you're already seeing some of that come out now. They had Cardinal Pizzaballa was in the Wall Street Journal today. He's the expert on the Middle East. I met with him a lot, and he's brilliant about the Middle East. And they've mentioned Cardinal Prevost, who used to be the head of the Augustinians, where our children went to Augustinian school. And we've known Bob for a long time. And then they always mention Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, who, when I was over there, I met with him at least 3 days a week, sometimes more, because he was in charge of all the ambassadors. So it's interestingly that there's three people that if they get it, I know them personally, which would be kind of incredible. But you never know. There's a lot of other people being talked about too. I'm not sure I believe that any of the third world cardinals are going to get picked. I think there's going to be a strong focus on picking a European and probably an Italian, because it's been a long time since there was an Italian, and it's been a while since we had a European too after Pope Francis. But and Italy has produced 82% of the popes. So I'd be looking for a middle-of-the-road Italian who can make both sides feel that they have a home.
Well, don't worry about your prognosticating skills, because we always do a year-end kind of a prediction podcast, and we went back for the 5th anniversary of my podcast, and I got it wrong virtually every time. So you're in good company if you don't pick well.
Yeah, I was about 0 for 10 last time when Francis got it.
So I think that's interesting, your point about not coming from Asia, the Philippines, or from Africa, because, kind of looking at it, that's really been great growth areas for the church in recent time. And I guess it begs the question, would having a pope from those regions accelerate the growth in those regions? Is that an important factor? What are the factors, that cardinals really would be looking for, do you think?
Well, I think you're going to return to this kind of conflicting view of post-Vatican II of what kind of church. And there will be people that are more interested in evolution under a traditional way, more of a Pope Benedict, Pope John Paul view. And there will be people that don't want to give 1 inch of the ground gained by Pope Francis. And so the person that can assuage those different priorities will have a pretty good chance, especially if he's an Italian.
As we're reading tea leaves here, there's been a lot made. The last time, you're looking at the selection of the College of Cardinals, Pope Benedict had appointed a huge number of cardinals, and you obviously got Pope Francis to emerge from that. This time, obviously, you have a large percentage who have been appointed by Pope Francis. Do you think there's anything to that? Or do you think it's these kind of more, more natural divisions and tensions that we should expect the debate to focus on?
Well, I think it's a very interesting statistic that we had this very conservative Pope be succeeded by a very socially liberal one. And I get, even though he'd appointed a lot of the cardinals. So I guess that shows us that these guys really do take their work seriously, and that they are in earnest in what they're trying to do, not just focusing on their particular position or view, and that could happen.
So Ambassador Rooney, as we wrap up our discussion today, obviously there are a lot of challenges awaiting the inbox of whomever's elected as Pope, from, as we just discussed, the sustaining these growing church memberships in Africa and Asia, and more recently in Europe, how to grow church membership in the United States, to all these political and diplomatic and foreign policy flashpoints around the world. So if you were advising the next Pope, what path would you recommend that he take that really is the best path forward to grow the church and inspire its congregants in a changing world?
Well, I think that I would certainly continue the aspects of Pope Francis's papacy that stimulated and enthused young people. And we've seen a lot out on TV the last few weeks since the Pope died, that he brought a lot. He raised the consciousness and attention span of a lot of young people about the Catholic Church. That's a really good thing. And you want to leverage that and continue that, because they're the future. And not just in the developing world where the populations are generally younger, but even in the United States, there have been young people on TV for 3 weeks here talking about Pope Francis and the church. Well, they probably never talked about the church in their life until now. So that's a very good thing, and I hope that will continue to be leveraged by the new Holy Father. With that being said, I think some, return to a little more doctrine focus, and maybe drop a few of the most radical ideas that he tossed out. He never acted on any of them, but some of them he tossed out some pretty radical stuff. You might kind of downplay that a little bit. I think most people would agree with his reform about divorced people getting communion. I mean, I think most people would agree that that's just taken for granted, but it wasn't. So there's a little bit of each. There's some things from him that need to be leveraged to continue to stimulate the growth of the church and the vigor of the church. But on the other hand, I think a little more focus on doctrine and respect for the process of in the Catholic Church would be good.
Well, Ambassador, I really enjoyed our timely and very interesting discussion today. For our listeners who might be interested in getting a copy of your book, The Global Vatican, or following the work that you're doing, what can they do?
Well, they can get the book on Amazon or any number of places, I think, but certainly on Amazon. And I don't know if they have it. They have had them at Barnes and Nobles, but I don't think there's very many Barnes and Nobles left. I would say Amazon's the best way to do it. And it's hardbound and hardcover and softcover.
Sadly, I think you're right. I don't think there are very many Barnes and Nobles anymore.
The thing about the book is I wrote it to show the important work the Holy See does. And I think this entire discussion here reflects the important work that the Holy See does in the world. And hopefully whoever's picked as Pope is going to be continue to be a leader in the world. And that's very important. We need the church to be a leader in the world.
Well, I think on that point, that's a good point to end our discussion. But Ambassador Rooney, thank you so much again for joining us on Next Round.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.